I'm Sarah Jackson, host of Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, a listening experience choreographed to help you elevate your internal communications to the pro level.
So, obviously with any large or, even smaller organizations, you'll probably see an overabundance of meetings being scheduled. A lot of our managers and leaders are, they're being invited to meetings, a lot of project and initiative level meetings without a clear objective or agenda in mind. You really have to look and make sure you get the data you need from that and make sure you have a plan in place to kind of follow through with it and set up one-on-ones based on that data. But, just really go back to your change management roots and look to how you could communicate that and have some change champions with each of those organizations that can really push forward and make sure that things are happening as you would like them to.
That's Tony Kihl, who recently landed a new role at the Cleveland Clinic. Now, I knew Tony when he worked at Apple. I wanted to have Tony on the show not only to highlight someone going through a job transition during a global pandemic, but to shine a light on how Tony used his experience to make meetings that matter, not only at Apple, but in his new role. Now, how many of us have ever been in a meeting and left thinking, yeah, that could have been an email? Meetings are so important and serve as a good low-hanging fruit to quickly show your value as an internal communicator. If you find yourself in a new role like Tony, consider enhancing your company's meeting structure. It results in increased productivity and time savings for your employees, two key factors for showing your ROI. If you want to help your employees make meetings that matter, this episode is for you.
My name is Tony Kihl, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for the Cleveland Clinic, overseeing all of their internal caregiver communications globally.
Well, I know, Tony, you and I met, I guess has it been a couple years ago at an ALI conference? I think you were with Apple then. And we connected then. ALI, they just always do such a great job at bringing people together. But we got reconnected because I recently was doing some research on meetings. And internally, my team was thinking there was some maybe opportunities to perfect our meetings. We had some of our other listeners talk about just the useless meetings, like, hey, that could have been an email kind of thing. And you jumped in with just this amazing research and tips that today I just thought would be so good for our listeners to hear, particularly if this is something that is a quick win for them to further show, their leadership on how they're, facilitating engagement, which meetings fall into that. So today we're going to uncover tips and strategies and plans for enhancing meetings. And before we kind of jump into it, if you wouldn't mind, giving us a little bit of your backstory of how did you get into this world of internal communication?
Yeah, no, thank you. And again, thank you for having me today. Excited to be here. So I guess my career path is probably a little different than most internal communicators, as when I started in my business career, internal communications was not even on my radar. So I worked for a couple different organizations. First, a startup, and then a larger organization in Time Warner. And I worked for them as more of a senior leader for their contact center. So managing everything from workforce management operations to leading an entire multi-site contact center. But what I found in both of these opportunities was a lack of consistent communications down to our frontline employees. They were missing key marketing and finance updates, which really led to bad customer experiences and bad employee experiences as well. So, in both roles, I ended up creating processes around internal communications, working closely with those groups that we needed communications from, basically creating an internal communication functions for those teams. And that really led me to have a real appreciation for internal communications and the impact it can have on an organization. It kind of organically led me to kind of pursue a career on that path, which took me to my role at Apple. And that's really where I began my internal communications career. And I worked at Apple for 8 years, kind of managing internal communications for their Apple Care organizations. So when I started that role, the organization was much smaller. So we just had a couple of thousand employees within Apple Care. And to take a step back, so Apple Care is anytime you contact Apple, Apple Care is the organization you're interacting with. So whether it's a phone call, a chat, a text, interacting online, you're working with the Apple Care organization. So that's the group that I would be supporting in that role. And so when we first started, it was a couple of thousand employees, and I kind of built up a content strategy for those employees. But by the time I left after 8 years, we had around 80 to 90,000 employees. So we saw a huge growth globally. So my team, was responsible for 24/7 global communications for Apple Care. And so we took care of America, Europe, and Asia, and we helped in that role, helped create that content strategy, create various internal communication processes, and create a lot of different channels from scratch.
Well, I love that you bring all that experience to this conversation. And, your presentation, when we were at ALI was, in just our conversation was amazing as well. And that was one of the suggestions this season from our listeners is, hey, can we listen to people that might have started outside of internal communications? And because we're worried about this group think happening. And so I love to talk to people who found their way here out of this, their passion and love for it, but also can bring, the way that their brain works and to bring not only your communicator brain, but your process brain, which we all appreciate. Like step one, step two, step three. Our listeners love that. So, well, before we get into talking about meetings, I always like to ask people just because it has been such a crazy year, particularly, obviously I know we're in 2021, but we're referring to 2020, and everyone has such a unique story. People love to kind of swap stories about what was that like for you since it was such a moment in our history. Tell me about your experience with COVID-19. Are you working from home? What's kind of going on? Because then did you transition jobs? Like, give us your story about that turbulent time.
Yeah, I will say, 2020 was probably one of the most craziest years I've been a part of. It really was quite a whirlwind from the start to finish. So, I started out my COVID-19 journey, I guess you could say, at Apple, where we started communications around these pandemics in January of last year. Because obviously we have a big Asia base. So I remember getting a phone call around 2 a.m., like a Friday night, and just being told that our sites are being closed and we're moving everyone home. And so having to manage, the crisis response around that and moving all of our employees home, figuring out ways how we're going to move their equipment home with them. Luckily, Apple had a really good infrastructure for remote work. I actually worked remote for Apple the entire time I was there. So um, that was one of the benefits of we already had infrastructure in place, but the problem was moving everything home and doing communication. So we had to figure out ways to communicate with our employees, wherever it was some type of emergency alert, emails, communicating with their managers, creating manager talking points, things like that. So, we really, moved quickly to make things happen. So as we started doing that in Asia, we saw this was starting to come across the globe. So we started making processes around how we were going to do this in Europe, how we're going to do this in America, until eventually we, moved all of our sites across the globe home, and started building out our COVID processes, which were really around pulling back on some of our normal communications and really focusing on the most important thing, which was COVID and the crisis response, and making sure our employees felt supported and they got the information they needed. So creating everything from like a COVID internet page to COVID newsletters to various leadership and executive type of communications that had to go out. So quite a big push there. I left Apple actually in May, so I guess you say it's a crazy time to leave during a pandemic. But this had an opportunity I mentioned earlier. This director of marketing communications for Cleveland Clinic, and having worked with Apple through this pandemic, I really looked at a healthcare opportunity as a great way to kind of support what's going on in the world. They really needed a lot of digital support, which I can offer in my role. Working through various things like an internet or a potential employee app down the road. And so I took the opportunity to jump at the Cleveland Clinic and join them in June. And so ever since June, I mean, it's been, foot on the gas, really supporting the team through the pandemic, various, again, executive level communications, real-time communications, especially for the clinic, which is on the front lines and has those frontline leaders and caregivers that are supporting patients and everyone in the field with COVID-19. And so it's been nonstop busy period since June of last year. It's been an interesting year because not only did we handle the vaccination, we supported the presidential debate we hosted in September, I believe. We actually, yeah, so we actually hosted that from a Cleveland Clinic perspective, and so working with those various groups like the Secret Service and the government to make that happen was interesting, and a lot of things around that were interesting as well. And then till now, we're handling all the vaccination rollout, so it continues to be a busy period for us, and we're continuing to work for all the different struggles and figuring out different ways to communicate.
For sure. Well, and I would imagine, where I know we're going to get ready to get into this, but the way that you learned at Apple how to bring people together, so much of our internal communication is the way we sort of lead and facilitate people coming together to get work done. And, meetings are a big part of that. And so I'm sure that that experience helped you to conduct yourself and to facilitate groups of people now in this role. I'm sure you're just shining, and we could talk about so many things, but I know we're here to talk about meetings. So we'll have to have you back on and talk about your digital strategy and all that good stuff, like part two with Tony. um, so let's jump in. So when we were talking about meetings, particularly when you were going down this road, what was the opportunity that you saw to enhance those internal meetings within, Apple and then now maybe even with your current role?
Yeah, so obviously, with any large or even smaller organizations, you'll probably see an overabundance of meetings being scheduled. This was obviously the case at Apple as well. Whenever we did surveys or had meetings, focus groups with the teams at the various sites, one of the common items that that was brought up to us was, wow, we have too many meetings. And I think you hear that in a lot of organizations, and sometimes that's kind of laughed off, like, yeah, we're all busy working for all these meetings, crazy week, right? That type of thing. But what we heard is a couple of alarming things when we were having these conversations. The first ones was the larger meetings we were hosting were being told that the content wasn't relevant to the audience all the way. There was probably content that was, being presented that was really more for America, and it was a global meeting, or it was more for like our iTunes organization, not really for the rest of our organization. And so, that was one thing that we wanted to address right away. The other thing where, a lot of our managers and leaders are, they're being invited to meetings, a lot of project and initiative level meetings without a clear objective or agenda in mind. And so those are, really alarming things that we hope that we can address from a communications point of view right away.
So I want to get into how you researched and elicited all of these feelings. And what's interesting is after reading your article, I took that and we applied with our team that same thing. And so there was a feeling, there were a couple people that were really vocal about we are having too many meetings. We are having too many meetings. So then we all just sort of assumed we're having too many meetings. But when we did the survey and really dove into it, we found out it really wasn't the number of meetings. People felt that the number of meetings was okay. And that they needed all the meetings. It was the content and and how the meetings were structured. So I felt like that step and that tip that you gave me in your notes on surveying the audience first, I think could dispel some feelings that people just have and think, but they're not. But it would clarify, well, this is why you're feeling this way. Tell me about how you went about researching your meeting data and what was really key to capture there.
Yeah, it was I would say, really a tense process, and time consuming, a couple of months for us because, we did the survey, as you mentioned, and we were able to get a lot of great data. But we also followed that survey up and interviewed basically all the leaders worldwide in kind of a one-to-one setting. Really getting, these one-on-ones help us really do an audit of all the meetings they were taking part in. As you mentioned, really reviewing what their schedule looks like over a couple of weeks time. So it wasn't just, what does your week look like this week, but hey, over this period of time, we kind of audited and reviewed and took snapshots of what their meetings were looking like, and really gave us a big data dump of everything going on in different levels of management, all the way down to our frontline employees. With that information, we were really able to see the amount of hours and times our team actually spent in meetings. We were able to get data such as, it was the content for particular meetings, in this time was only 50% of the content was relevant to this particular leader. And so they spent 50% of their time in a meeting that wasn't relevant to them, that kind of thing. Um, some key data we found as well was for some of our senior leaders in particular, they spent 35 to 40 hours a week in meetings, which really took away from their effectiveness to run their organization. As I mentioned on the larger meetings, we discovered that in total, about 30 to 40% of the content was not relevant to the entire population. It was only applicable to small parts or a particular part of the world. We discovered in times, that our attendees really weren't paying attention to their screens. So one of the cool features that we had with our WebEx was, the attention rate they have in their meeting platform. So we can see how many people are actually reviewing the screen or reviewing a presentation while the meeting's happening. And, we were averaging about a 50% attention rate, which means they just had it on in the background. They really weren't paying attention to what was going on. It wasn't relevant. They weren't getting much out of the meeting. So that was another issue that we discovered. Another problem we discovered, our meetings weren't really being treated like the large scale meetings they should have been. People were presenting off of video in some cases. We had people presenting from a bus, other crazy scenarios. And I think what happens is, we're in a virtual environment. You feel like, oh, it doesn't matter where I present this from. It's going to come across the same way. But what we really wanted to get across with this research is, God, we really need to get back to making sure these large scale meetings are being treated like a town hall. So if you were on site in a meeting and had, like our meetings average around, for larger manager meetings, average around 1,500 people in attendance. So if you thought about putting 1,500 people in a town hall in a room, would you treat that meeting the same way as you're doing it now from a virtual point of view? And so, that's where we needed to get across. We needed to make some changes to really make sure these meetings were, happening the way they should have happened.
Yeah. Well, one of the cool points we figured out too in our research. And again, I can't thank you enough for this because we would have never done this had I not learned from just, again, this great notes page that you gave me. Was, one of the things we uncovered was that only half of our team likes to verbally engage. The other half, they do not like to talk in front of a big group. So we started to implement different things like e-poll and using the chat feature. And so I think, to your point, to really reimagine and be intentional about what is this meeting for? How do we want people to feel? And then through that, you can reset expectations. Like, should the camera be on or should it be off? And do that. It's so good. And all those data points, I think, also linked to the internal communicators ROI factor, so that now you can say we saved X amount of time making these meetings more efficient by saving employees this many hours a week. There's so many good gems from doing the survey. Any mistakes you made with your survey that we can learn from, or this part of prep going down this meeting route?
Yeah, along the way, I feel like, the survey was a good part for us, but where we made a mistake is we had a good amount of data from the survey, but we tried to run with the survey data on its own merit. And for us, I think in some organizations, I think the survey will be a really good launching point and you can get a lot of good data. But I think what we didn't have enough was, follow through with the survey as far as, we only had 40% of our employees take the survey that we wanted to take it, which is a pretty good number, but I don't think it hit all of our global region. For example, our Japan population, out of that, they might have been like 0.5% of that 40 took the survey. They're just in Japan, for example, we found that from a culture point of view, they don't like taking surveys like this and giving feedback in this way. And so we had some other regions like that as well. And we had, just some leaders not able to get to this. This is why we kind of launched into our kind of one-to-one setting. I think the survey is a good point, a starting point, but then, you really have to look and make sure you get the data you need from that and make sure you have a plan in place to kind of follow through with it and set up one-on-ones based on that data. And so I think it kind of, held us up for a little bit. We tried to run with the survey data on its own merit first, but then for us, we needed to do really follow through it. It probably cost us a few weeks of time, where I think if we would have just kind of went right into those one-on-ones right after the survey, we probably would have got through this a little quicker. But in all in all, it was a really good learning experience from us, both ways.
Staying connected with all your employees is more vital now than ever. Circle Broadcast is excited to announce the latest addition to its internal communications platform, Circle for Mobile. With Circle for Mobile, you can send essential employee and crisis communications straight to your employee audience. Break through the noise to keep your employees in the know and safe. Find out more at circle.com/mobile. Now, Tony has us off to a great start when we're thinking about how to empower our employees to enhance their meetings. Now, in this next part, we're going to learn how Tony restructured his meetings, and we dive into the process of how to make those enhancements. And Tony talks about why a dress rehearsal for your meetings are key for your presenters. He will also show us how he used new channels to replace meetings, giving employees back valuable time in their day. Let's pick up where we left off. Yeah. We made a mistake, I think, on how we worded some things. So we had to also go back and clarify and say, well, what did you mean by that? And things like that, too. So, God, great tips on making sure that you're also surveying them in a way that they feel comfortable, right? I would have missed that. So, you get the data back, then what do you do? How do you then how does that manifest itself? How did you restructure your meetings? Tell me what some of the results, good and bad, were.
Yeah, no. So, we started off first with really wanted to tackle our large scale meetings because those are the ones from the communication point of view we owned. And we felt like we could really have, the most positive impact at first. It'll be the shortest time of impact, where some of the other meetings, like project and initiative meetings, are going to take a little longer. So we really focus on what we can control first and make a really positive impact, while having the project meetings is more of a priority, second priority that we can focus on as we go along. And so, what we first ended up doing was creating a monthly meeting for our frontline leaders and senior leaders. In the past, we had numerous weekly or biweekly meetings scheduled for different levels of leadership. And we felt like, a lot of those meetings really, again, weren't relevant the whole time, or they were being canceled because not enough content, or we felt like a monthly meeting was good enough for us to really reach our manager audience, and really kind of, that's our, in this case, was our most important one to reach, because it's such a large audience. It really kind of talks to their frontline employees and had the biggest bang for our buck. And so, these meetings, we set them up to really be for organization wide updates or global updates only. And so, instead of having a lot of non relevant information from other parts of the organization or other, regions, we only presented items that would impact the entire organization. We also changed the way we selected topics for this meeting. In the past, it was almost a free for all. So if someone presented, asked for, a content to be in a meeting, as long as it, made sense, and it was, on our brand as far as like the keynote, and it looked good. It was in a good enough format, no mistakes. We kind of allowed it to go through, long as it was approved by, leadership. But what we found is leadership wasn't always looking at that each and every week when we were trying to get that approved, and so it led to some topics getting through that maybe should have got through. And so what we started doing is we put together a meeting committee that reviewed all the topics, before the meeting. So they reviewed and they would have to approve it. And we had, representatives from all parts of the business. So maybe IT or HR or finance or whatever the different groups would be. And they were tasked with, whatever meeting once a week. Could be a quick 30-minute meeting, get together, review the content, see if it makes sense, see if we should hold back on it, or if it doesn't seem like it's organization-wide content, we would say no, and we would, as a communication team, find other areas to how we could communicate that just to that particular org or that particular region instead.
Well, I love that. What I'm hearing you say is, you were able to step in and maybe provide some guardrails or, an organizational framework for these meetings so that they were effective based on the survey data. And we did the same thing. What came out of that survey data for our team, and it was simple, was you need to make sure you put what is the intended outcome of this meeting, and a few agenda points. And what's funny is some people, later that week canceled meetings because they thought, I haven't really thought through this, and so now, people are really encouraged, and the culture is encouraging a good meeting culture, like, hey, make sure you come prepared, because a lot of people would throw a meeting on your calendar and you're like, I have no idea what this is about and what I'm supposed to do. So any other things that you did, kind of structural things like that, that might be helpful, for the internal communicator to provide, their teams with, hey, this is how to run an effectively great meeting?
Yeah, to help with more of that presenter effectiveness, I think you mentioned it, where some people really weren't engaged in a meeting. As I mentioned before, our attention rate wasn't quite there. What we did is we put a limit on all topics to 10 minutes. Now, that seems easy enough, but we got a lot of pushback on that at first because they're like, "Well, this is actually going to take me 20 minutes to really go through and review." And what was happening is they were trying to use meetings as a training almost on some content. And so what we had to really push back on, like, listen, this is a quick, concise 10 minutes that keep the audience engaged in your topic. Anything we found past 10 to 15 minutes, the audience started, going away from their screen, not really paying attention. So this 10 minutes really kind of forced our presenters, and we kind of did a lot of training and working with them to make this happen, but it really kept their content tight and concise and kept them engaged. And we would, how my communication team would help make that happen was we would kind of review each of those content submissions and really suggest areas of opportunities, maybe to add in multimedia or to add in audience engagement such as polling or e-survey polls within the application we're using, or certain questions you can ask the audience to try to get their feedback to get them engaged as well. That way it's not just someone talking the entire time.
I love that. I love that you were able to show value that way, because people, they don't know. Yeah, 'cause keep going.
Yeah, no, the other thing we did is my communication team, we wanted to treat this like a town hall, as I mentioned before. So we started holding a dry run before each of these meetings. We did something similar before, but we didn't go into as much detail. So we really held a more thorough dry run. We treated each of the meetings, again, as an in-person town hall. We required all of our presenters to be on video, and we, asked them to present their content before the meeting itself. That way we can be sure that they can kind of go for the content. There's no stumbles. Their audio works. Their video works. There's none of those. Hopefully, they're talking but on mute type of situations. And so we try to really work through those things and see if we can resolve them before the meeting itself. And then my team would kind of go through and review, questions throughout the meeting as well to make sure that every question that our audience was asking in our chat or if their hands was raised, to make sure they were being addressed. And if we ran out of time, for example, in a 10-minute topic, we would make sure we write down all the questions and they would be addressed in a post after the meeting, just to make sure that, one, everybody has the opportunity to have their voice heard, all questions are being addressed, but then our presenters are able to present their content in a really concise fashion that was really engaging with the audience.
Well, and I bet that process of I mean, it seems so common sense, but we forget, you're right, to do a dress rehearsal of sorts. And again, I think this just really positions the internal communicator in such a valuable spot to kind of be the producer, almost, up levels, the company's image and brand, and like, all right, these things are, if you're taking people's time, like, we've got to be super prepared. So I love that tip of doing a dress rehearsal. I would, again, another thing I would have missed.
Yeah, and we, like I said, we did them before, but I think the way we treated them was we would just kind of make sure everybody can access the meeting link. They would kind of run through their slides really quickly, like click through them, and then yeah, they're good to go. But we really try to focus on put them in almost a meeting setting, where because what happened was our presenters would the light would turn on, and then things wouldn't quite happen the way we planned them to. So really trying to turn that light on in a dry run, dry rehearsal. That way, by the time they got to the meeting, they got some of those nerves out of the way. They've already one rehearsed their content if they hadn't done it before, and they went through this whole process of how it will work in this meeting.
Yeah, so maybe pushing them, although it might feel awkward, that, hey, this is a dress rehearsal, even maybe setting expectations so that they don't just kind of slough through it. I think that's even a key thing, that, yeah, because if they do, then it's kind of, you play how you practice. So to make sure that you do kind of do the real thing, like a real dress rehearsal. What a great tip. So, when you were doing all of these things, did it unearth that you needed extra tech or tools? And if so, how did you get budget to get, some maybe enhancements to make your meetings run better?
So, for us, we were able to use we used WebEx. We were able to continue to use WebEx, but what we found was Slack really was one that we were able to push for and get. And kind of take a step back to our project meetings. When we looked at the project meetings where we talked about major initiatives, major projects, and trying to get some of those meetings off of our leadership's hands. What we found was a lot of those meetings were even being ran by a leader in the organization, or someone from our support organization who really did have maybe a background in project management. And so what was happening was meetings were being put together where there wasn't really a strong set of agenda, as we talked about before. And they weren't getting as much out of the meeting as they possibly could. There was people that were being invited to the meeting that maybe should have been there. There were duplicate meetings happening across the organization about similar topics. And so what we found is, really working with our PMO team to start owning a lot of these major initiatives or projects outside of their normal, maybe 5 or 6 top priorities we're working on for the business. So we actually, one of the things we got budget on was working with our PMO team to really build upon their PMO team and bring on almost almost junior level project managers of sorts that will come on and help us manage these initiatives. So if our business has a few different initiatives that they need to work on, these junior project managers will come in, own the meetings, own setting them up, owning the agenda piece of it, and really focus on either a once a week or once a month meeting around this project or initiative, and then have follow throughs and readouts that are happening throughout. And then what we use Slack for, what we really found valuable with Slack is it kind of took the place of a lot of these ad hoc, quick 30-minute meetings that were happening throughout the week for these projects or initiatives, and allow really those conversations to happen in various channels within Slack, where you can have that one readout meeting once a month, and then the rest of the time you guys could be talking and working through things and strategies in the Slack channel, so you don't have to be bombarded with meeting after meeting every single day. I would say, I was kind of hesitant when we first went to Slack, but after using it for a while, I mean, it was definitely something that saved us plenty of time. And it was allowed us to move a lot of our smaller meetings into this channel and a lot of our collaboration outside of meetings into the tool.
Now, did you so talk a little bit about that agenda? Because again, our listeners love tactical advice. Two things here. Did you say, all right, here's a sample agenda, here's kind of the expectation on how to run this meeting? And then did you do the same thing for the new Slack tool? Like, this is what the general channel's for. This is what, how did you socialize that and train people and set expectations? Tell me about that.
Yeah, no, good question. With our agendas, we work really closely with the PMO team to really kind of create what a set initiative or project meeting would look like. So here's the agenda. We would talk about what our problem is. Here's our, subtracks of what we're doing to get to this, the solution on this problem. We have the readouts from each of those subtracks, and then you would have what the next steps would be. Really focus in on, here's the next steps, and have an email sent out afterwards. Here's the next steps. Here's what everybody's working on, and kind of be done with it. And so what we would do is create a nice keynote template that every project manager would follow. And they would just kind of fill in the blanks for every single project, every single initiative. Again, it seems simple, but it wasn't happening before. So having that kind of one keynote template that they can really use over and over in different projects and just kind of fill in the blanks really made it more consistent across the board with what the conversations were happening. It made our leaders and different support organizations knew what they had to accomplish before the meeting, or knew what we were going to be talking about before each of those meetings took place. Our PMO, working directly with them, kind of owning that. What helped them owning that is it was a smaller group, so consistency happened much quicker than, say, if we're trying to get all of our leaders on board. Really having them own these meetings really helped us make that consistency happen over a couple month period of time as we kind of transition to that model. As far as Slack, yeah, so we help create some general guidelines. So you know if you haven't used Slack before, so you can set it up any way you want, but there's usually some basic announcement channels that go to everyone. But then what we used is a special private project channel. So if you had a channel dedicated to like career development, if it's a project, anybody that's on a career development project team would be in this channel, and only they would see what's going on there. And so, what we would do is have whoever's leading that initiative kind of own that channel. They could pin updates. They could pin the top attachments you need for that project, or pin links you need for various, internet sites or wherever the content may be that you're talking of at the time. And they would kind of own the conversation there. They would build in polls and surveys, and we would just kind of work with them to build out a strategy for what those sites look like, what they should have looked like, some do's and don'ts. but just really go back to your change management roots and look at how you could communicate that, and have some change champions with each of those organizations that can really push forward and make sure that things are happening as you would like them to.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and we have, some upcoming episodes, tackling change management. So we'll make sure that listeners tune in to those to apply those concepts to changes in your meetings. One more question here as we wrap up. Anything that you can think of that a blind spot that maybe you had that, or a failure, a learning? What's one thing that as we go down this road we might miss when we're leading, maybe in a meeting initiative that requires, changes?
Yeah, I think for us it was a little different. We had obviously a global organization, so our challenges, came more from again that culture or regional Pacific, where it really, it could be that our European area, may have done meetings or projects a little differently than our Asia group does and our American group does. So we had to kind of discover it wasn't a kind of one size fit all. We had to make some slight adjustments for one. Slack, for example, wasn't as well used in Asia as it was in America and Europe. So, really getting people want to adopt to Slack at all, or in some cases we use maybe another platform that was very similar that they used in Asia and try to get it to work. It's same thing where things were just done a little differently, and processes were a little differently. So don't be afraid. For us, we were trying to keep everything as one size fit all, but don't be afraid to make things change if it needs to be done for your organization, if it's a regional difference or part of the organizational difference. But don't change it so far that it changes the consistency that you're looking for with these here. So really, it's just about listening to your employees, and really, from the survey to the one-on-ones down, and really creating almost a communication mapping for these meetings for each of those regions, which is something we did an awful lot of times with communication mapping, just to make sure that we were doing things that were more personalized or relevant to each of those parts of the organization.
Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing all your notes. I know we'll be putting things in our show notes. If you have any meeting templates that you want to share, send them our way. We'll put them in the show notes. That we all love to see, examples and to steal stuff off of one another. So I can't thank you enough for your time, and just what a great set of insights and tips. And I think this is a low hanging fruit, sort of, um, type initiative that internal communicators can tackle, that I think quickly enhances your perception, because meetings, let's face it, they're a big part of internal communicators' purview. So thanks so much, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you having me again.
Well, there you have it. Tips on how to empower your employees to make meetings that matter. Now, we'll include Tony's tips and his information in today's show notes. Stay with us next week as our journey to uplevel your internal communications to the pro level continues.
Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective and proudly supported by the Circle Broadcast Suite, an entire suite built for internal communicators. Learn more at circle.com. And don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.